Okay, I've been over this before, but these arguments don't work for just any old god that you can imagine. Take the cosmological argument that anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And if these two premises are true, which I defend in other videos, not to mention blog posts and podcasts and lots of content that I create, then it follows that the universe has a transcendent cause beyond space and time, is immaterial, powerful, is uncreated, and is personal. Now, if you do a survey of world religions, creation texts, you will see that very consistently they have a god or gods that create within an eternally existing space-time realm. They don't have a transcendent god beyond all physical reality. No, these gods are existing within a previously existing space-time realm, and they're just bringing order to stuff that already exists. There's only really four viewpoints that have a god that creates space, time, matter, and energy. There's Judaism without Jesus, Christianity, Islam, and deism. I say viewpoints because deism, the other three are religions. Deism is just a philosophical view. Now, to know which of the four you ought to hold to, you have to go beyond the cosmological argument, and I would say look at the historical evidence for Jesus' divine self-understanding, his death, his resurrection. Look at the historical reliability of the Gospels. But then you have the ontological argument, which says that if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. If he exists in some possible world, he exists in every possible world. Since the actual world is a possible world, it follows that a maximally great being exists. Well, what is a maximally great being? A maximally great being is a being that has all great-making properties to their maximal extent. So if power and knowledge are great-making properties, then a maximally great being will have power and knowledge to the highest extent possible. In other words, omnipotent and omniscient. Omnipotent and omniscient. He would be omnipresent because being present is a great making property. He would be morally perfect because that is a great making property, and he would be necessarily existent. Now, what God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, morally perfect, uncreated? It's not Zeus, because he had a beginning. It's not Thor, because he had a beginning, and neither of these are omnipotent or know everything. This kind of comment just shows you haven't done very much study in comparative religions, or you haven't understand the arguments from natural theology, or both. I recommend getting my book, The Case for the One True God, a scientific, philosophical, and historical. Athanasius says if you take each individual pieces of evidence, a natural explanation is obviously more likely, but when you cram them all together, a man resurrected, and then he gets cut off because he finished it in a separate comment. But he says, is it more likely that a man was resurrected, or is it more likely that somebody just, made it up? It's just a myth. Well, we've kind of been over this in my maximal data argument presentation series on this channel. The gospel I have defended the traditional authorship of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are written by the people who followed Jesus, and I've refuted the arguments against that. And I go into way, way, way more detail on my blog about this. I really recommend the written blog series because the TikTok series did not do as much justification. And there's lots of evidence for the historical reliabilities of the gospel. There's lots of external confirmations, like, extra biblical authors, Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Mara bar Serapion. There's archaeological evidence. There's internal evidence, like undesigned coincidences, unexplained illusions, unnecessary details. The criteria of authenticity can build a cumulative case for the trustworthiness of the gospels, and so on. But in the short version of the argument, well, in the blog series, it's a long version. Given that you only have three possibilities, and I call it the Magruian trilemma, and I form it in the form of a syllogism. One, the gospel authors were either lying, mistaken, or telling the truth. Two, they were not lying or mistaken. Three, therefore they were telling the truth. Now, in my blog series, I Actually, the whole series is debunking the lying option. But in the TikTok that I made, I just appealed to the evidence for their martyrdom. They would not make up tall tales and then get themselves unalived for it. Now, for the mistaken option, I was only able to get into the hallucination theory, and nobody else brought up any other naturalistic theories throughout the course of that TikTok series of videos. But in part 9 of the blog series, I go through a whole host of possibilities for how they could have been mistaken, that skeptical scholars have brought up, and none of them work. So, by process of elimination, it follows that the gospel authors were telling the truth. Now, I know you dispute the traditional authorship of the gospels, but I would really recommend that you do some more digging, because I think you do so without just cause. But I think you do so because none of the options for how they could mistaken are the least bit tenable. So you just have some guys who said they saw something, and there's 3 possibilities, and 2 of them don't work. Maybe this might be a stronger argument against the minimal facts approach, but it doesn't work against the maximal data approach, which I've defended in my most recent articles and in my most recent TikTok videos. This has got to be one of the worst arguments for skepticism that I have ever heard come out of the mouth of any internet infidel ever. On literally any issue that you can think of, there's disagreement. There's disagreement even in areas where you think there wouldn't even be disagreement. And you could make this exact same argument in every single area. Well, if there's so much evidence for evolution, well then why do so many Christians not believe it? Why, if there's so much evidence for global warming, why are there so many conservatives that don't believe it? Or, if there's so much evidence for atheism, if it's such a supremely rational option, then why is the vast majority of the world some form of theist? You see, this actually doesn't do anything to address the arguments, to address the data, the evidence that needs to be interpreted. It is a red herring. It just does nothing to address the arguments for the truth of Christianity. It just doesn't. And the fact that this argument, this talking point, can be used against you, and it can be used against pretty much anyone in any area of debate, folks, don't be like this person. They want me to perceive you as an intellectual who I can engage with on an equal level. When you make assertions, back them up with arguments and evidence. Laugh reacts are not arguments. Facepalm emojis are not arguments. If you make an assertion such as the names of the books are not the people who wrote them, Matthew is not the person who wrote Matthew, and Mark didn't write Mark, look, I'm not going to hold it against you that you hold an opinion contrary to my own. I'm not going to hold it against you that you disagree with traditional authorship. That is, unfortunately, the majority view in New Testament scholarship. There are a minority of scholars, a large minority, who hold to traditional authorship, like Craig Blomberg, Michael Licona, just to name a couple of examples. But if you're going to say, no, these people did not write these books, then you're going to need to provide some arguments to the contrary. Making an assertion is just that. It's an assertion. You can claim anything. I can claim that I have an entire army of pink elephants in an underground facility under my house. You can make that assertion. Anybody can make an assertion. All you have to do is just put words together. But unless you put a logical argument to that assertion, it is nothing more than you just spouting your typical atheist neckbeard BS. And yes, I said neckbeard. Are you familiar with this meme? The fat, man-boobed guy with all of the atheist memorabilia behind him. He's got tally marks out of all the internet arguments that he's won. That's you, Mr. Noob. That's you. Because all of you have done is resorted to mockery, derision, and mere assertions. You have not said a single rational thing throughout this entire discourse. Now, I have plenty of material on the traditional authorship of the Gospels, which you just totally abandoned. You just went into all sorts of all over the place, which is why I said you had ADD. You talked about Moses and the burning bush, and you said, well, if you had physical evidence for God, you'd be the richest man in the world, which is a neckbeardy atheist argument that I plan on addressing in the future. But I've got plenty of material on arguments for God's existence, the evidence for the gospel's reliability, the resurrection. I've got an 11-part blog post series on my website. I'm going to put it up on the screen here. And I've got like 12 or 13 TikToks in which I make a case for the resurrection of Jesus on the supposition that the Gospels were written by who the church has traditionally claimed them to be for thousands of years. I provide arguments for my assertions because that's what intellectuals do. Please learn from this. If you want to actually engage me like an intellectual, feel free to do so. Until then, don't waste my time. Yeah, you annoy me a little bit. People who make assertions and resort to mockery, derision, and do nothing but make baseless claims, those kinds of people get on my nerves. Those people are not intellectuals. Those people are, these are the kinds of people who think memes are scholarship. And I'm not going to put up with that. We don't do that here on this channel. We have respectful back and forth. We support our claims with evidence and arguments. And that's, we debate. Also, no, I did not give any evidence for gospel authorship in the past 2 or 3 videos that I have made. But I have in the past. There are 13 videos on this channel where I give positive evidence and also respond to objections from critics like Bart Ehrman and others who try to argue that no, the Gospels are anonymous. And it is clear that you have not watched any of those. There is a very in-depth essay on my blog on cerebralfaith.net in which I go into the external evidence from early church fathers, the manuscript evidence. I go into the internal evidence, things within the Gospels themselves, which kind of betray who was holding the pen, who was putting pen to papyrus, and it has an estimated reading time of 100 minutes. That is a place where I go into the evidence. And I have read that article aloud on my podcast, the Cerebral Faith Podcast, which is 2 hours long. You could avail yourself of any of this material and interact with it, but no, instead you choose to resort to mockery, derision, laugh emojis, facepalm emojis, typical neckbeard things. Oh, in case you think that is unchristian, you should probably read Matthew 23. Jesus wasn't afraid to call people names when the name stuck. He called the Pharisees snakes and broods of vipers. Now, comparing you to a stereotype, the unintellectual atheist, I think was pretty I think my video was actually quite tame. And even now, all you're doing is just making condescending remarks in my comment section rather than actually making points. Even if you made bad arguments, I would prefer you make bad arguments, really weak arguments, than just make assertions and condescending remarks. It's not too late. You could always go back and look at some of my earlier videos where I give the arguments for traditional authorship, arguments for God's existence, etc., and you can leave your counter arguments. You can do a stitch where you make a video of your own, because I know that TikTok's comment section is ridiculously short like Twitter's. You can go on my blog. That you can leave one long comment explaining to me why my arguments fail. You could do that. There is nothing stopping you from doing that. You can go to my YouTube channel. Pretty much most, if not all of my TikToks are on YouTube or are going to be on YouTube at some point, and the comment sections on there allow you to write pretty much an essay if you want to. You can go on there, watch my videos, and explain to me why I'm wrong. But no, you don't do that. You won't do that. And you know why? Because you're the kind of person who doesn't know what they're talking about. You're the kind of person who reads Reddit threads rather than peer-reviewed scholarly journals. You're the kind of person who thinks memes amount to intellectual argumentation. I know your kind. I've dealt with your kind for years. And if you're not going to address the data, get off my page. You're wasting mine and everybody else's time. Well, I'm glad that you took the time to watch one of my debates since the last time we had a conversation. But you say the popular belief in science to explain the Big Bang is universal rebound theory. I'm sure you've never heard of that, though. Yes, I have, and it is not the most popular way to account for the Big Bang. It was about 50 years ago. The idea that the universe is someday going to stop expanding and then retract, and just sort of retract and then expand again. The most popular way to account for the origin of the universe nowadays is what I call the Mother Universe theory. The idea that we are part of a wider multiverse. And this multiverse, this larger universe, is sort of birthing babies. And these smaller universes are being birthed from the wider universe. Now, there's problems with both of these. Let me first address the rebound view. The first is that science shows that the universe is actually accelerating in its expansion, and as the universe accelerates, all of the galaxies and planets and matter will get farther and farther apart, and gravity's influence will get lesser and lesser and lesser. Eventually, everything will be infinitely far apart from each other. The universe will not collapse, and therefore it will not rebound. The second problem is philosophical. It's the problem of the actual infinite. If the universe has been expanding, contracting, and then rebounding from eternity past, then before this expansion round, there had to have been a contraction and rebound before that. And before this, there had to have been an expansion and contraction before that. And before this, there had to have been a rebounding and a contracting before that, and so on back into infinity. What happens is that no round of expansion and contraction could have come about, because each round of expansion and contraction would have an actually infinite number of expansions and contractions that would have need to have taken place first. Therefore, no expansion and contraction round could have ever come about, and then the present moment would never have arrived. But obviously, it has arrived. So this means that there either has been no cycles of expanding and contracting, or there have at least been a finite number of them, and therefore the universe still has a beginning. Now, the problem with the mother universe is that there is a non-zero probability that at any point within the mother universe, a universe will spawn. And these universes are expanding. Each birth is its own Big Bang. But given eternity past, there will have been a universe spawned at every single point within the mother universe. And all of these baby universes will have gotten so big and so numerous that they would have coalesced together and formed what looks to be an infinitely large and infinitely old universe, which contradicts the observation that we live in a universe of finite size and age. Well, the way that some atheists try to get out of this is to say, well, maybe the mother universe is expanding. That would accommodate more room for all of the smaller universes that exist within this wider multiverse. Well, once you do that, the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem applies to it. If the mother universe is expanding, then rewind the clock, and the mother universe gets smaller and smaller and shrinks down to a singularity beginning, and therefore the mother universe has had a beginning, and it must be explained. Now, if you want to posit a grandmother universe, you just run into the same problems. Athanasius says there are far more possibilities than those three: legend, miscommunication, doctrinal motive, propaganda, plagiarism, fulfilling prophecy, even lying. I don't think you quite understand the argument. The Magruian trilemma, as I put in another video: one, the gospel authors were either lying, mistaken, or telling the truth. Two, they were not lying or mistaken. Three, therefore they are telling the truth. This is the second stage of a two-step argument for the resurrection of Jesus, the maximal data argument. It depends on the historical reliability of the Gospels. Now, the maximal data argument, this argument has been misinterpreted by a lot of Christians. There is a long version, there's a short version, and the longer version, you can get into a lot of evidence for why the Gospels are trustworthy, external evidence from archaeological evidence, external written sources like what Josephus and Tacitus say, which confirm and corroborate what the Gospels say, so that they're trustworthy sources, and you can inductively infer that they are telling the truth when they tell you things about the historical Jesus. But the short version is really great because it just depends on the supposition that the Gospels are written by eyewitnesses. That's why I put a lot of stock in traditional authorship. And once I have demonstrated that, and I have in past videos, you specifically, Athanasius, you and I have been around the block with this across 10 TikTok videos. But I also have a very long essay that on my blog that has a 100-minute estimated reading time. I know that's a lot, but I really recommend that you and others check that out. If you don't want to read it, there's a 2-hour podcast in which I read it aloud on there on the Cerebral Faith podcast. But like, once you get that conclusion that Matthew was written by Matthew, John was written by John, Mark was written by Mark, got his information from Peter, then things like legend, well, what kind of legend? It can't be of an embellishment type, because you're getting the information straight from the horse's mouth. Doctrinal motive, well, that would pretty much, what I'm basically interpreting you as saying here is that they were lying. they had a motivation to invent the doctrine of the resurrection and Jesus's miracles and things like that. That's the same as lying. I don't see that as a separate plagiarism. I'm not sure. I think I know what you're referring to there, and it is the very bogus idea that Jesus is a copy of pagan myths like Mithras and Horus, and I really recommend that you check out Inspiring Philosophy's video here on that, debunking that whole notion. But again, if you've established that the Gospels are written by eyewitnesses, then you have they are either lying about it, they're making it up, they're either stealing it from the pagans, the whole plagiarism option, they're doctrinal motive. I mean, most of the things you mentioned here are just different variations of lying. Or they sincerely believed it, but they were mistaken. And here I would appeal in a short version of the argument to the external evidence for their martyrdom. But if I had a lot of time, like if I was teaching a course or if I had a conversation with a friend, I'd go into like all of the reasons why the Gospels are trustworthy. They get lots of things right, undesigned coincidences. But I guess if you successfully defend the gospel anonymity hypothesis, then you open up the door to legend and miscommunication and things like that. I was kind of feeling a little bit bad about the harsh rebukes that I gave to you yesterday in video form, but I don't feel quite so bad about them anymore. You have shown me that you are utterly unwilling or incapable of having an honest intellectual discourse. I'm not sure if you're just dense or if you're just a troll who gets off on picking at Christians and getting a rise out of them. But in any case, the fact that this is how you characterize biblical hermeneutics, after I've left a comment explaining what the rules are, and you still say stuff like this, it just shows me that you're either dense and you're not getting it, or you're saying things to purposefully get a rise out of me. Either option is not very good. But no, hermeneutics is not just reading verses however you like and picking out what makes you feel good and making the scripture fit what you want it to say. It's designed to do exactly the opposite of that. For example, you read a verse in its context, the paragraph, the passages that come before and the passages that come after it. You read it in its cultural context. You get in the shoes or the sandals of the biblical authors and the first century audience. And a good way to do this is to read John Walton's Lost World series, Michael Heiser's The Unseen Realm, or the NIV Cultural Background Study Bible, which it helps you to think like an ancient Near Easterner would think. You also let unclear verses interpret the clear verses, because we believe the Bible is divinely inspired, 2 Timothy 3:16, all scripture is God-breathed, and therefore we can interpret cross-canon. And so if you've got abundantly clear passages in like a dozen different books that say X, and you have one verse, a very weird verse, that seems to say non-X, then you interpret the verse that seems to be saying non-X in light of the avalanche of scriptures to the contrary. The fourth principle of biblical hermeneutics is progressive revelation, which is, remember that the books of the Bible came one at a time. And a fifth is keep the genre in mind. There are some books of the Bible that are history books. Some are epistles, they're letters. Some are poetry books. Some are wisdom literature, like the book of Proverbs. It's just a list of wise sayings. So the genre can help you determine the meaning of a passage.